we're in a different era than we were in 2009. I mean, there's no 2008. There's no doubt. But President Obama has used the post-election period to I guess, presumably talk about his book and to cement his legacy in some way. There's a lot of legacy repairing needs to be done because when you go from Obama to Trump, regardless of the different sort of like factors that caused that, some of which are outside of Obama's hands, some of which were inside his hands. I mean, there was a massive foreclosure crisis that, and I don't want to go into the specifics of it. People can go back and look at our interviews about this, about HAMP and all these other programs, and Tim Geithner wanting to. What is it? He wanted to foam the runway, as it were, for the banks. There was a lot of people who lost their homes. There was a lot of foreclosures, a lot of failure by the Democratic, from a policy standpoint, and of course, from a political standpoint, loss of 1,000 seats across the country. So Obama's out there. He has taken one more opportunity to practice respectability politics, as it were. He has said, he's weighed in on the defund the police thing, and look. We've talked about the slogan is not necessarily the one that Madison Avenue would have chosen. The reality is you have half a dozen cities across the country now that are actually following up on the proposals. Minneapolis saw a poll today that city. I think 75% are interested in or in favor of defunding the police, in terms of essentially cutting down on their portfolio and shifting resources away from the police to other agencies. But here's the thing. It's one thing for us to talk about this, but if you are genuinely believing that defund the police was a slogan that hurt Democratic politicians, which I do not think is a legitimate charge, why would you be out there as the most prominent Democrat in the country talking about it 4 weeks before an election in Georgia that is going to determine whether Joe Biden will have any power to do anything? Again, it's about his legacy with total disregard for ostensibly the project that he's supposedly protecting.
I think we're seeing that all around, right? I think we're seeing out of a lot of center left, ostensibly liberal sources, a kind of disdain for the defund the police, abolish the police rhetoric that is born entirely out of their own, I guess, unreflected upon class and social interests, right? It's impossible to have these conversations about theoretically the anxieties that are felt within, liberal spaces about defunding the police, because the people who exist within these spaces, at least people like Obama and a few pundits out there, refuse to take personal responsibility for those opinions. Obama can just come out and say, I like the police. I remember when that guy that cop harassed Dr. Lewis Gates Jr. and Obama invited them both to the White House for like a beer and schnitzel thing going on.
Well, Kaepernick needs to think about the pain he's causing military families by kneeling.
Exactly, right. It's another way to obscure who's responsible for not liking defund the police. We know, people who are out there protesting the police, they know that center right-wing people do not like the idea of defunding the police. They know that they like the police, right? But within leftist, liberal, center, left, Democrat spaces, however you want to call it, the position that we should change the slogan to appeal to some imaginary out group that already that is just not interested in messing with the police in any way, that is not giving them more money or allowing them more power to harass minorities of many different colors, creeds, and religions. We can't have a legitimate conversation about it. Because ultimately it's about polling says that people like the police. Polling says that, studies say, and say, okay, but let's talk about the role that the police play within the Democratic Party. Let's talk about the role that, these police chiefs play in Democratic cities where theoretically there is no Republican or right-wing sort of population to concern ourselves with. Why are the police still behaving this way? Because I think, again, how are Democrats obscuring their role in this? They're placing it on populations who might theoretically be in favor of the police, like the suburban moms. But, frankly, from my position, suburban moms don't like the police either. No one likes the police. Police don't like the police.
or the agency that Democratic politicians have to change the conversation surrounding policing and maybe be proactive, make their own case politically. I mean, Obama wants to punch left, blame activists, blame politicians who might be more sympathetic with the base and activists, as opposed to having any introspection about his own role, Democrats' own role in shaping their own narratives. Republicans do it all the time. They're great at marketing themselves. Democrats will do nothing and then blame the left always 100% of the time reactively for losses when it's really because they chose not to market themselves at all.
Well, I would just say in response to that, I agree. I think the Democratic Party has in many ways given up the sort of project of consensus building. Everything is telling people why we can't have nice things because of blank group of people who won't allow us to have nice things. And, it pushes for, it instills in people a lot of bad habits. The idea that, we need to have 51% of the population sign off on anything before we, decide that it's a civil right. The idea that, the Democratic Party is incapable of changing people's minds on healthcare through using the bully pulpit. I think that's the kind of narrative that is, both fatalistic, but still kind of egotistical, right? Only Democratic Party's voters are capable of recognizing these things as good or necessary. So we can't do them, but we can still pat ourselves on the back for being on the right side of various issues. I think the defund the police thing becomes a bit more tricky because Democrats have an unreflected upon like of the police too. And so while they're trying to frame it as an outgroup thing or something that, would be generally unpopular, they're revealing a lot of their own personal anxieties about removing that kind of cudgel from society.
And the very elitism that honestly now regular voters are associating with the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republican Party based on their attitudes.
Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical about that narrative. I mean, frankly, because I don't know that I've seen that type of there's really data beyond sort of the commentariat. But what interests me about Obama is, in one hand, I saw a passage from his book where he's talking about that moment in Cambridge where Gates was attempting to get into his house, and a local Cambridge cop, approached him, and they got into it. And in his book, he talks about Gates being, sometimes a little surly, and maybe, I think the implication was that Gates may have gotten aggressive with the cop. Having grown up and actually spent a decent amount of time in Cambridge, I could tell you my experience with Cambridge cops and with Massachusetts cops and broadly, I suspect that cop was a little bit more brusque than maybe Obama gives him credit for. But what's interesting is in his book, he says it was a misunderstanding type of thing. But in a talk with NPR from a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about the police issue, and he says, we don't like talking about the fact that if you grow up in a certain zip code, you're much less likely to be to get a good education. You're much more less likely to be a part of networks that allow you to ultimately get a good job. You're much less likely to get good social services in those areas. And that's not the police's fault. That's society's fault. But we'd like to distance ourselves from those responsibilities, lay it on the police to say, just keep it away from us. And when you start seeing that as a consequence of that failure to address deeper inequalities, inevitable tensions, conflicts that pop up, then we're confronted with stuff that we don't like discussing and talking about. And the issue of the particular event between the police officer and a black person who's interacting with them becomes the focal point. But it really raises a broader question, which is, why is it that we're still living in a society with such inequities exist? And my answer would be is because you're talking about this theoretically, and you are the president.
Yeah, he knows something about distancing himself from responsibility, or one doing so.
I mean, it's fascinating to me that he almost pathologically can only see this in the abstract, as opposed to you're to the extent that there's an individual who can do something about this. You're the guy, and yet you're making this confrontation about the personalities of the cop and the professor.
Yeah, it's this neoliberal academic lens that the Democratic elite fetishize.
No, I mean, I agree, right? Obama comes out and talks like he's been a professor of law at Harvard for the past 12 years, that this is his first time dipping his toe into like politics in the kind of big P arena that we consider. And it's just not the case, right? He distances himself through abstraction. And like you mentioned, he makes this a conversation about two individuals, the cop who was in a bad mood or might have been in a bad mood, and the professor who was in a bad mood who just had a misunderstanding. And it obscures the role that institutional racism plays in these kinds of things. And, it also obscures the role that he plays in, or he could have played in changing this more substantially. And also, I think, it obscures the fact that we have now entered this new phase of the Democratic Party, where symbolism is, the narrative has fully supplanted reality for a lot of people. Like Obama as this sort of mythical president who never did anything wrong, but also whose record we cannot look too deeply into because his hand was always being forced by either Republicans or other special interest groups who wanted him to do things that he didn't really want to do. And so I think when you're looking forward, when we look towards like what the Democratic Party is demanding now and what their leadership is saying, you see a party who is confused about the language going forward now that the problem has become real for a lot more people, right? Before, I feel like this is Obama's 18th autobiography, but, before you could spout these platitudes and it was like, well, yeah, that, this is just a story about two people having a bad time. And now it's just like, okay, but now cops are roaming my neighborhood, evicting my neighbors because they don't have jobs. I see it much more, I see it realer now. So like, I think that Obama's role is every few months come out and try to re-up this veil that things are still going fine for the core Democratic voter who is still able to appreciate, working from home because their job was easily transitionable into that kind of like, setting, if that makes any sense.
What is fascinating to me is, and I should say that I'm sympathetic with the idea, and it was years ago now, but I interviewed Randall Kennedy, also a law professor at Harvard, who I think may have known Obama personally, on his book, The Persistence of the Color Line, about the Obama presidency up until I think it was 2012. And the idea that Obama had certain parameters because he was the first black president, or maybe not even necessarily the first, but just that he was a black president in this country, that he was inhibited in many respects from reacting in ways to maintain some measure of unity. Now, the problem is it didn't work. It did not work. And what strikes me as that sort of argument that he had that he was sort of inhibited, which I would believe, right? I mean, there's like a Jackie Robinson quality to this. Why do we see him continuing to do this now? Well, that's the thing. It's like, I think this is who he was.
Well, I mean, I will say, I feel like every president, at least in my lifetime, who gets voted in by Democrats is the first black president. Said about Clinton, Obama, Hillary Clinton was going to be the first black president too. It's just really their thing. You got to applaud them for that. But I think a lot of the times, anyone who works in a corporate setting recognizes the Democratic Party for what they are. It's like, it's middle manager politics. It's middle manager speak. They always want to play that sort of interstitial role or pretend like they do of like commiserating with the working class, commiserating with people who are being kicked out of their homes, who are being denied health and care, who are, in many ways being oppressed by the state that they are representing in some sense. Like they want to pretend like they are on our side, the same way a middle manager might pretend like they're on the employee side. But, we still have to work late. We still have to work at 9 o'clock. If it were up to us, if it were up to us, we would have universal health care. If it were up to Democrats, we would have universal health care. If it were up to middle manager, we would all go home early and get a raise. But the boss, this overarching figure of authority who is sometimes Republican, sometimes a poorly defined block of voters who we have to appeal to, never like an oil industry lobbyist. That's never who we talk about as the real concern. It's always just like there's somebody who has more power who's impeding their motion. And I think that's where you see this very, aggressive fecklessness on their part and on the part of their voters, where it's just like, yeah, we are in it together mentality, even as they do their best to screw us over.
Yeah, it's like you're going and trying to get a car, and the salesman's just like, well, I got to check with my manager. I don't have the ability to do that. Brandon Sutton, folks can check out the Discourse podcast, which you co-host.
Not blog. I'm illiterate. Sorry.
There you go at patreon.com. Expand the discourse. Brandon Sutton, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. I loved it. I had a bit of an ear infection, but I still heard you both clearly. So
there we go. Win-win.